Right, I hate this bit. I hate doing the intro bit. Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon of Savageries and today I'm delighted to be joined by Lockhart in Liverpool. Although you can't tell because we're in the back of Waterstones. But look, you can tell what the book is that we're going to be talking about slightly, but we're also going to be talking about Genuine Fraud, which, now you know that I loved We Were Liars. Loved it.
Thank you.
I adore Genuine Fraud. I think it is just as tricky. And it's how do I say it? It's as complex and it's got as many twists, because that's why I can't really talk about it too much, which makes it really difficult. Why'd you do this? Why'd you do this to us?
I like to write a twisty book. I like to read them, so I'm really just trying to give readers the same experience that, I've had in books that I've most loved.
Yeah. But with both of these books, I'm going to hold them here like this. In both these books, one of the things that you've done that's joyful
I love that
is...
you're holding... You have a snake... No!
That's an octopus.
It's an octopus. There's all these animal
Imogen
rings.
doesn't have an octopus.
She doesn't have an octopus.
Because
but
I
there
stole
are
it off her.
all of these animal rings in Genuine Fraud. And I have a snake ring and I have a one with a fox, sort of carved into amethyst.
Oh, that's really interesting, because
Yeah.
I was asking earlier, we were doing an event earlier, where you get those little characteristics, and you were saying they're all in your subconscious and they just pour out. We should say a little bit about the book, shouldn't we? Jewel is an amazing character in the fact that from the off, we know something's a little bit off.
Yeah.
And we follow her going backwards, which is really interesting. So we start on chapter 18, and we go all the way back, and we find out why she is where she is, what she may or may not have done, and then also the truth that she tells herself to cope. Is that a fair enough description?
I think so. I usually just say it's a thriller about two girls who look enough alike to share a passport.
That's so much better than my version. I'm just going to go and hide behind these books now. That's me done.
But I practiced. Like that's,
And you did
I've
write
been
it, to
out
be
and
fair.
about running through the UK and Ireland talking about this book, and so that's my spiel.
So where did the whole idea behind Genuine Fraud come from?
Well, I knew that I wanted to write another book that was a psychological thriller genre, and I'm a big fan of Patricia Highsmith. I think, we were talking earlier before we ran the camera, and it's clear that you've read a lot more Highsmith than I have, but I have read a number of her novels and reread them. In particular, The Talented Mr. Ripley and Strangers on a Train. Both of those books are stories that allow you to get into the mindset of a person or persons who do very, very bad things. But she makes the characters very human at the same time. So I was interested to write a story that was kind of on the Talented Mr. Ripley plot line, but about a teenage girl set in contemporary times. And I wanted to tell it backwards in order to kind of force the reader to get progressively closer to a character who might not really be so relatable. To go backwards towards the moment when we are very much like Jewel, when Jewel is more innocent, less experienced, less complicated, or at least the difficult parts of her personality haven't come to the surface yet. So I wanted to write this kind of story pattern backwards. And then I started to write it, and I realized that Highsmith was one of my influences, but that I also was thinking a lot about superhero comics and superhero origin stories and the kind of, violent, vigilante type of person who gets to be a hero versus the type of violent vigilante person who gets to be a villain.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking about like Victorian orphan novels, kind of orphans on the make.
What is it about orphans? Because orphans are they're a big thing in literature, because you've got Jane Eyre, you've got Great Expectations.
Vanity Fair.
And then also you've got Harry Potter, and they've gone through history. What is it that's so great to write with an orphan as the kind of main protagonist?
Well, I think it frees the main character from the family of origin, and that is kind of permission to reinvent the self. And I think one of the subjects of the novel, at least starting in the 19th century, is the definition of the self in relation to society. Like that's kind of, you could say that in a pretty blanket statement about novels written in English,
Yeah.
And make at least a semi-viable argument. And that's something that I'm interested in. And I think that young adult literature, which is, the field that I write in, is very much about the separation from the family of origin and the reinvention of the self, right? And that's what Ripley does. That's what Great Expectations is about. That's what Genuine Fraud is about. That's what Spider-Man is about.
Yeah. Which I was pointing out earlier, that actually Bruce Wayne is pretty much like, and I've got the note, it's not Pip, is it, in Great Expectations?
Yeah,
it is Pip. I was right. I was correct. Let's be. Pip sounds such a more cheery character than he is.
No, he's not so happy. That's one of my favorite novels of all time. I love Great Expectations.
It's one of the only Dickens I've ever managed to finish, which I should probably be thrown off BookTube for that.
You're such an amazing...
My mum always goes, you can't not like Charles Dickens. I'm like, have you read Wilkie Collins? I prefer a bit of Wilkie.
I've read The Moonstone and The Woman in White.
Armadale is my favourite of his, and I strongly recommend it. It had a heroine, or an anti-heroine, who got banned from literature initially because nobody could believe she was that evil. A woman could be that evil.
Really?
I think she's misunderstood. So that's my...
That sounds right up my street.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But misunderstood characters, or characters that are out of kilter with what we would classify as a likeable character, is also something that you really like to delve into.
Yes, I do. And I, those anti-hero stories are just more commonly told about men, and usually middle-aged men. Think like a Al Pacino movie or something like that. Scarface and, The Sopranos and things like that. And I love those stories. And why do I love them when they're so different from my experience?
Yeah.
I think it's because they find a way to kind of give voice to something that's very human. You know what I mean? And there's like a release and almost a fun in reading about it.
And what does it appeal to you because actually in Genuine Fraud there is a main two characters, Imogen and Jewel, and neither of them are particularly likeable, and yet they have a bond of sorts. What appeals to you as a writer about because there's quite a snarky yet loving yet snarky yet venomous thing going on?
I have written about the dissolution of friendships a lot. Like a lot of my earlier books were comedies, and yet a lot of the emotional drive of those books was the dissolution of a friendship, and the kind of aftermath of that kind of breakup as opposed to a romantic breakup. And so I think this book is a way for me to explore the same territory but from a different angle, right? I mean, I think these two young women are genuinely friends, and yet their friendship is based on lies, and I was interested in that tension.
And speaking of lies, which sticks right at the end of both these books, is that, do you think there's a difference between telling a lie and telling yourself a truth that comforts you from a reality? Because I think in both books you look at that in a different way. This is where you're free to go, no, Simon, you're talking absolute rubbish. Could you get out of this bookshop?
Well, in our conversation earlier, we were talking about Freud, and that's not something I've trotted out before. So you got like my fresh Freud idea.
Fresh Freud, hashtag.
My juicy fresh Freud idea. So I read a lot of Freud in college and graduate school, and not so much Freudian theory as the case studies. He wrote up these case studies of patients of his, and they don't really have clear answers so much as they are a record of the therapeutic process. What you realize when you read them is that there is like an answer, and then later there's another answer that kind of contradicts the earlier answer, and then later there is yet another answer, and that what really matters to both Freud and the patient is whether the patient is getting less neurotic. In other words, if the patient is better able to function, the patient is no longer obsessive, the patient is no longer, paralyzed for no physical reason, or whatever the thing the patient was suffering from. So the idea of the Freud case studies is that what you are doing is trying to create a coherent narrative that explains the patient to him or herself. And that made a huge impact on me. The idea is that not that you're trying to uncover the truth or the fact, that you are instead trying to create the story that makes sense.
Okay.
emotional sense.
Yeah.
And that's why different interpretations or different stories later on in the therapeutic process might be equally useful. So that truth is a slippery thing, right? There's the emotional truth, and then there's like the actual literal truth. And so that's definitely something that I'm exploring in this book.
And also, one person's truth is totally not another person's truth because we see everything from so many different sides.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a vision, and I mentioned this in the talk that we did, of you having this wall with post-it notes everywhere, threads, picture, the whole works, because the plots are so cleverly wound together.
Thank you.
How do you get all that onto the page, and do you have it all as a plot in your head to start off with, and then you have to mix it up for the reader? And also, how do you stop it from at the end the reader feeling manipulated? Because you don't with either of these books. You just think, oh, that was a good ending.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that's like 6 questions.
It is. Plotting, let's go with plotting.
This sounds so hokey. I try to be emotionally truthful. Like, I try to be like honest and make difficult characters as close to my own human feeling self as possible, so that the plot is coming from, you know, real human impulses rather than from a desire to manipulate the story.
Okay. See, that answered all 6 questions in one go.
All right, thank you.
That was that easy. And an ultimate question for me. Now that you've gone to the dark side instead of the humour side, are you tempted to just stay there? Is it something that you really enjoy? Do you think you'll go back to comedy at some point?
I think I will go back to comedy at some point because it's a joy, and I love reading them. When something makes me laugh, I am so grateful and happy and consoled, you know, in my life by funny books. And I reread them very often just to kind of go back and remember that the world can be bright and sparkling and ridiculous. But I'm working on another kind of, I wouldn't call it a thriller, but it is a very eerie book.
Oh, I like a bit of eerie.
Yeah.
And finally, what books would you recommend to people, apart from your own? There was no plug there at all. But what other books do you recommend to people to go and read, apart from The Talents of Miss Ripley, which I now really want to go and reread, and Stranger than a Dream?
They hold up really, really well. And Great Expectations, that you should reread, yes. Or maybe a little David Copperfield. It's really long. Don't be scared of it. Oh, you know what I read recently that I really liked, and I know some people get really worked up about it, is Boy Snowbird.
Oh,
by Helen Oyeyemi.
I've wanted to try her this year.
She's a fantastic storyteller. It's got some big twists, and
isn't that based on a fairy tale as well? Isn't it got Snow White in it?
It's got Snow White threaded all through it.
Ooh.
But it is a realistic story. But there are moments where you feel this like sort of breath of magic almost like underneath it without anything overtly magical happening.
Oh,
so she's really got a very sure hand in a way that I thought was incredibly cool. And because We Were Liars has all that fairy tale stuff layered in, I was really fascinated to see how somebody else did that layering, right? And that was a pretty incredible book.
I think we'll have to run out and get that one. But before we go, there is a giveaway with this video, and you could win the deluxe edition of We Were Liars, which has got all sorts of lovely extra stuff in it. You can win it wherever in the world you are. I would like to know, I don't know if you'd like to know this, but I would like to know what people's biggest lie they've told is that they're happy to put on the internet in the comments below. I think that's a good challenge.
You suspect that your viewers are liars?
Everyone's told a few lies in their time. Surely.
You're going to learn a lot.
But for now, thank you very much for coming on the channel.
Thanks for having me.
Go and get these books. Ta-da!